"You're fired." The words were small in syllables and enormous in consequence. They landed like a paperweight on my chest, precise, deliberate, final. Victoria Marshall said them from behind her desk. The corner desk, 2 windows, a view of the city that always looked like a promise. Her nails tapped once on the glass paperweight as if marking time. I held the torn edge of my own request form in my hand, the paper still warm where she had ripped it. She tore it without looking at me, slowly, with that corporate calm I had learned to read as a species of contempt. The paper fell, whirls of white against the low-pile carpet. It fluttered mournfully like a small, obedient flag. For a heartbeat, I only watched it fall. I could hear my pulse like a recorder, steady, oddly boring. It was almost a relief to have the waiting end in a single, readable gesture. Victoria did not raise her voice. She never had to. "We can't have people leaving at the drop of a hat," she said. "Your account needs consistent leadership. You asked for a week off with only a note. That's not how we operate. That's insubordination." "I gave you notice," I said. "I left it with Jenny in accounting 2 days ago." Jenny's name barely moved the vibration of her lips. "You gave notice to accounting? This is a client-facing role. You don't give accounts to accounting." I thought of the folded note in my bag, the one I'd written in shaky script at the hospital, beside a man who had told me once that the size of a handwriting said something about the size of the hand that had written it. "It was a medical leave request," I said. "A 1-week leave to care for a patient." She tapped the paperweight again. "Medical leave? Sarah, we have policies. You could have used sick days. You could have—" "I don't have that many," I said. It was true. All the unpaid hours logged, the work pulled forward, the nights rewriting proposals to fit futures that never landed. Sick days, in practice, were a currency I didn't possess. Victoria leaned forward the way she did when she wanted to make it look like empathy. "This firm runs on reliability. Our clients expect a standard. If you abandon your post without ensuring coverage, you compromise us. There is a particular kind of humiliation in being told you have compromised bigger things." But I hadn't left a meeting. I hadn't vanished. I had arranged coverage. I had stapled the handoff notes to my monitor and sent an email at 11:02 p.m. the night before, because that is how we survive in the accounts world, by being preemptively present for every absence. None of that mattered. What mattered was her sentence. The word "fired" folded the room into a geometry where I had to find my exit. "Then you're fired, Sarah," she said again, brisk, as if closing a tab in a browser. "Effective immediately." There are prouder ways to lose a job. I would have liked to have had a conversation about severance or a neutral reference. I would have liked to be coaxed toward a different title in the company I had served for 6 years. But the industry breeds brevity. She had a meeting at 11:30 and a private equity partner waiting for her call. She had a new hire in HR who did not yet understand the weight of small cruelties. None of that was her problem. I folded the torn edge of paper into my palm as if it could be made whole again if held tightly enough. I felt the fabric of my clothes, the seam at the wrist, the way my blazer had become a second skin over all those years of presentations and lunches and late nights. I felt the small pocket of my bag where I'd put my house key and a photograph of a dog I'd once fostered. My life had been organized around a schedule and a title. To be told that title was over in a single declarative sentence was, unexpectedly, liberating. "I should go then," I said. There wasn't any triumph in my voice. I had practiced none of the righteous exits you'd see in films. I simply took my tote and my phone and handed Victoria her form back, careful where my fingers touched the jagged edge of the rip. She nodded toward the door as if to conclude the transaction. "Human resources will be in touch." "They will," I said. I could see the sentence forming, a polite, corporate lie. The camera in my mind caught the moment. The city beyond her windows like an indifferent sea, her heels clicking away. The form lay on the floor, a small economy of paper crying for attention. Outside the office, the hall felt the same as it always had. The glass walls dissolved the people within to shapes and shadow. Mark from creative was at his desk with his headphones on. Jenny from accounting looked up and then looked away, embarrassed to have been the courier for a request that now meant nothing. I caught Nick at the security desk and didn't stop. The elevator doors closed on my reflection. Someone in a navy blazer who could, apparently, be folded up and put away. I walked down the flight of stairs instead of taking the elevator because I needed to leave in a way that felt like motion, not stasis. The city smelled like rain and exhaust, the way the city does when it cannot decide whether to be tender or indifferent. I stepped out onto the sidewalk, and then I heard the one thing I had expected. The room inside me that had been used to organizing other people's needs suddenly emptied of requirement. It was a strange kind of weightlessness. People kept their heads down as they passed. The newsstand man called out a headline about markets. The world continued its rotations. Still, inside me, an answer had settled. I was going to go to the hospital. I had been walking that way since the request had been torn, back to the person I had said I'd care for, the man who'd once told me that people reveal themselves by which novels they refuse to put down. I did not cry in the lobby. I did not make a spectacle. I walked through the doors and caught a cab to the medical center, because when everything that anchors you loosens, you either float away or you find something to cling to. For me, that was a hospital corridor and the soft voice of a patient named Thomas. If you enjoy stories about workplace justice and second chances, hit like and subscribe. The hospital was a different kind of corner office. It traded a skyline for the fluorescent hum of ceiling lights and the courthouse geometry of sterile tiles. The smell was a neutralizer, antiseptic and lemon, and the faint, human perfume of someone trying to sleep through pain. Thomas's room was a thin rectangle of privacy curtains and white linen. He had the window seat and a stack of books. When I came in, he waved the book toward me like an offering. "You're late," he said, but it was the lightest of reproaches. "Traffic," I said. Traffic, meaning the world that had just tried to insist I remain its asset. "How are you feeling?" He squinted at me as if weighing whether the motion was there. "Better now. You look like a woman who has just been discharged from a prison cell." "I wish I had a parole officer," I said, because humor keeps things moving. His laugh was small and grateful. Thomas Edwards was the sort of man who dressed like he had an opinion on everything. A blue scarf even when it was warm. A watch that had been polished by hands other than his own. A silence that carried lineage. He spoke with a Midwestern inflection that refused to recede, and the voice of someone who had spent a lot of time making decisions that affected other people's lives. I had met him 2 weeks earlier through a volunteer reading program attached to the hospital. The idea was simple. Sit with someone for an hour, read aloud, be present. I signed up thinking to do a good deed, a line item on the ledger of virtue. The first time I'd read to him, he'd been asleep after chemo and had woken with a start when my voice softened over a paragraph. "Keep going," he'd told me. "If you quit on Fitzgerald, there will be consequences." "Fitzgerald," I said now, peering at the cover of the book he held. The Great Gatsby, as if the world had narrowed to a single, inevitable novel. "It's not the first choice," he said, "but it's a good one. Had her back. She knows how to make people feel like small saints or large idiots." We'd cultivated rituals. The book, a stack of crossword puzzles. I was terrible at the obscure clues. The way he liked his tea, almost no sugar, a note of stale lemon. He told stories in fragments. A house in Cleveland, a first wife who collected porcelain, a man who built an investment firm with his hands and then professionalized it with his mind. He told them not with nostalgia, but with a clarity that seemed to pick events clean of myth. "I made money," he'd said once, thumb tracing the rim of his mug. "Then I made more. And then I learned the currency is not the point. It's what you do with it." It was the sort of line you expect from philanthropists in documentaries. But Thomas said it in a room where the curtains were drawn so tightly the light came through like a question. He said it to me, not to a camera. When he learned I'd been fired, he didn't blink. He only asked, "Do you regret it?" For the first time in 6 years, I allowed myself to answer, without rehearsed sentences about networking and opportunities. "No," I said, "not yet." It was a truth as much as a protective measure. Saying yes would have admitted a fracture I was not ready to define. Saying no felt honest and scored the room with a certain courage. He nodded like a man appreciating a craft being done properly. "Good," he said, "because I can't abide people who make cowardly choices under pressure. I have enough of those stories to fill a library." We read that afternoon. Gatsby, certain passages that made him smile at the audacity of youth and the way Fitzgerald loved failures. We argued about nicknames in the novel and whether the green light was optimism or delusion. I read in a voice that aimed to be steady, and when he drifted in and out of sleep, I filled the gaps with description, painting the scene of long lawns and parties so he could travel without leaving his bed. Visiting him became the axis of my days. The hospital fitted its own hours around him and me like a small ritual. I'd bring books. He had preferences I catalogued like a librarian. Fitzgerald if he wanted to laugh, To Kill a Mockingbird if he wanted moral vexation, The Bell Jar if he was feeling particularly wry. He called my reading taste practical, which I accepted as a compliment. He liked to hold court with small jokes that landed soft and true. There was no pretense of kinship at first. I was an account executive who had been dismissed for doing what most people would call a basic human thing, caring for another. He was an investor with a cautious laugh and a briefcase that had seen more executive floors than mine had emails. Between us there was a stack of novels and the quiet confidence of two people who had lived enough to know where their edges were. He told me, in the long evenings, about money in a way that never quite bragged. "Money is a solvent," he said once. "It dissolves excuses. It lets you see what remains when you remove the scaffolding. For me, it factored into everything I didn't want to look at." "Like what?" I asked. He shrugged. "Like the choices you make when someone else is counting on you. Like whether you put profit before people." It felt dangerously like an apology without a subject. He had been estranged from his children for years, by his own account, a fact he spoke about without bitterness, more like an observation on the ledger of life. "People buy into excellence and then forget the conditions that made it possible," he said. "They make rules. They forget what happens when rules break someone's life." I thought of Victoria and her paperweight, and the way the corner office made small cruelties feel like operational necessity. I kept that thought in my pocket like a coin, never to be handed over lightly. There were days when he was lucid, and days when he was not. When he was lucid, he told me stories that sounded like miniature fortunes. He had once made an investment in a fledgling software company that later sold to an international firm for a number that made newspaper headlines. He said it casually, as if crossing a street. When he talked about his late wife, Evelyn, he let the sentence lengthen, a small private sorrow that I recognized as a many-petaled thing. He didn't ask for consolation, only for me to listen. On one rainy afternoon, as the room smelled of lemon and warming oil from a tray of soup, I found his briefcase sitting on a lone chair. I had not been meant to see it. It was a leather thing, the kind people who measure their successes by tactile standards possess. I told myself it was curiosity, an occupational hazard of someone who reads people's cabinets in order to map them. But I told him too. "Mind?" I asked, and he waved me toward it. Inside, the briefcase smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and the old paper of open-ended ledgers. There were contracts with names of companies I knew, Marshall and Associates among them. In a heading, I might as well have been reading my own obituary. There were other documents, letters in angular script, airline stubs, a small shoehorn. And then I saw the envelope. Cream, weighted, sealed with wax in a way that felt too theatrical for hospital life. His hand tightened around his mug. "Ah," he said, "you found that." "There is," I began, self-conscious, on the threshold between privacy and duty. "It's no secret to anyone who actually bothers to read the back pages," he said. "But yes, I've been an investor in a few businesses, including Marshall and Associates." He watched me as if waiting for the word to land. It did. Marshall and Associates, Victoria Marshall, the corner office, the ripped form, the sudden, small geography of how the world connected. Hospital bed, corner office, sealed envelope. "You didn't say," I said. Thomas smiled the thin smile of someone who had, finally, set a chess piece down. "People like me have the luxury of choosing when to talk. I prefer to be a quiet influence. It keeps my inbox tidy." "Why keep it quiet?" I asked, because the question felt like a key. "Because influence shows its best face in results," he said, "and sometimes it's interesting to see if the person in charge is still guided by principle when no one is watching. I'm not interested in glory. I'm interested in leverage." He turned his wrist to show me a gold watch that might have been a prop from another life. "I have one request. If anything happens to me, if I can't speak for myself, I have a way of making my voice heard." It was dramatic, the way he said it, but not performative. It landed like an instruction manual folded into a novel. "What way?" I asked. He tapped the envelope. "That belongs to the person already in charge. It is a letter and some instructions. It will mean something to Marshall and Associates. You can deliver it if you'd like." I felt the room tilt like it does when you discover an extra chapter in a book you thought you knew. "Why me? I'm not—" "You showed up," he said simply. "And I like people who show up. Besides, you have the advantage of having recently had a run-in with Marshall. It might make the delivery more dramatic." I laughed, but it had a hollow inside. It was not just the glee of dramatic timing. It was the realization that a single envelope could reconfigure a room the way a match reconfigures a house. "What's in it?" I asked. "A letter," he said. "Sealed. Not a court threat, not a press release, not an ultimatum in the traditional sense. A condition, an invitation, a set of terms, really. Something to steer behavior." Terms. The language of the marketplace slotted into a hospital bed as neatly as a hand in a glove. I thought of policy and procedure, sick days and HR memos, and how rules often made a theater of indifference. "Do you want me to—" I began. I had never, in my life, delivered an envelope as a political act. I had delivered invoices and decks and presentations. I had never been a courier of moral leverage. He reached out and took my hand once, with a gentleness that surprised me. "If you can do it, yes, but do it your way. I wouldn't have it any other way." There was something almost conspiratorial in his injunction. He named no details, promised no outcomes. He simply placed a responsibility and shaped it as a trust. I took the envelope, feeling the weight of the wax and the possible futures trapped inside. It was heavier than it looked. "If it's about Marshall and Associates," I said, "you should know I was just fired." He nodded, as if that calibrated something in his mind. "That will make your trip more interesting. Power is most malleable when it's exercising itself. Give them something they didn't expect." "Why not call?" The practical part of me, the one who used email signatures and held calendars in cubic precision, asked why he didn't pick up the phone and deliver the request like any other investor. "Phone calls are reversible," he said. "Letters are archival. They live in drawers." I looked at the envelope like it was a miniature fossil. It had a name on the front, Victoria Marshall, and then nothing else. The wax had been stamped with the simple emblem of an oak leaf. It felt older than the world in that room. "I'll deliver it," I said. "Do what you must," he said, smiling. "And remember, if you find yourself feeling small, hold the book. It has worked for me." The weeks that followed grew into a rhythm so precise it made me dizzy. By day, I scrolled through days-old emails and interview responses. I updated my resume in the tiny hours. By evening, I was at Thomas's bedside, reading passages that made him sigh with amusement and sometimes, infuriatingly, with envy at the audacity of youth. We shuffled the books beside the bed like old friends. We argued about Fitzgerald's moral compass and whether Gatsby's desire was noble or catastrophic. He grew weaker, yes, but not in the way television scripts imagine. He grew weaker in bureaucratic increments, a lab result, a slow afternoon, a quieter laugh. He remained himself. He remained the man who found small delights in spooning soup and calling waiter names from memory. He remained the man who, on a Thursday with rain on the window, told me a story about a time he'd been in a boardroom where a woman had thrown a pen at a table and the action had changed the meeting's gravity. She made a point, he said. It was the sort of aggression that lives in the species of people who are half business and half necessity. At night, I'd think about the briefcase in my apartment with the sealed envelope inside. I'd run my thumb over the wax and imagine the way Victoria might react. Would she be furious? Would she offer to reinstate me with honeyed apologies? Would she laugh as if nothing had happened and file it away? The possibilities arranged themselves around the corners of a future I hadn't planned. There were practical matters that made themselves apparent. I could not simply march into the corner office and slam the envelope down at the foot of Victoria's polished shoes. Part of me wanted that, a riotous gesture to match the ripping of the form. But I had learned the ways of influence, the subtle machines that turn gestures into policy. If Thomas had invested through channels, then there would be legal processes and fiduciary responsibilities, and the kind of papers that asked for signatures in triplicate. The envelope might be a narrative, but it would need a scaffolding. Internal contradictions were part of the work. I was someone who had lived in calendars, and now I was about to do something that would rely on the human elements I'd been taught to minimize: decency, patience, stubbornness. I practiced my line in the mirror at home: calm, not vengeful; firm, not theatrical. I practiced letting the envelope speak for itself without my editorializing. The day I decided to go back to Marshall & Associates, the city wore late spring light like a coat. I carried the briefcase in one hand and my own bag in the other. At the door, the security guard, Paul, who had seen me in 9 different states of reconstruction across the years, gave me a look that was more curious than adversarial. He had been one of the few who had come to wish me luck when I handed in a presentation 5 years prior, and then stayed on through a night shift to rewrite a pitch. "You're back early," he said. "I'm delivering a letter," I said. "A letter for Victoria?" His eyebrows rose. "Yes." He looked at me as if I were an object of a story that might be nice to retell. "Good luck," he said. "Don't let her make you small." His words were small and true, and I stored them like a charm. The elevator hummed and the floor numbers climbed. My reflection in the elevator door showed the briefcase and my face, and, if I squinted, the ghost of that torn form inside my bag. Everything about the moment felt like a hinge. Victoria's office looked exactly the same as the morning I'd been fired. Polished chrome, 2 windows, a city that kept arranging itself into new stories. She stood at one of the windows when I entered, hands clasped as if she were holding the skyline in check. She turned at the sound of my shoes against the carpet, and her face measured me the way someone appraises a position paper. "Sarah," she said, the single word a barcode. "I have something for you," I said. She did not immediately move to the desk, which meant the moment would be surveilled by her posture. "We are not taking deliveries right now," she said. "If this is a courtesy, you can leave it with my assistant." "It needs to be in your hands," I said. My voice felt steadier than I expected. "It's from Thomas Edwards." She laughed, short and shocked, like a paper being creased. "Thomas Edwards?" Her expression shifted. For a second she looked older, not in years but in the way fear makes youth contract. The investor? He asked me to deliver it, I said. I could see the flicker of risk cross her face. A calculation. He wanted his letter to be personal. She paled just enough that the blush in her cheeks vanished. If this is about funding, she began, and then stopped as if the sentence had reached a cliff. I set the briefcase on her desk, and then, with deliberate slowness, I opened it and pulled out the cream envelope. The wax seal looked absurdly ceremonial in that room. I placed it on the desk as though it were a document that had always belonged to that polished surface. Victoria stared at the envelope as if at a thing she had loved and then found infested. Her mouth pressed into a line. "Do you realize what this means?" she said, fewer words than I'd imagined before I walked in. "I realize it has consequences," I said. I did not say what I had already been thinking, that the moment of her power was not hairline thin. I did not say that she had just discovered the first tremor of an earthquake and now had to decide whether to build differently. Her assistant, a young woman with a clipboard who always smelled of citrus, hovered in the doorway. Mark and Jenny came out of adjacent offices like actors catching up with an evolving script. The air itself seemed to be listening. "You were fired for insubordination," Victoria said finally. Her voice had regained some of its nastiness, but it was now a sharpened thing, the hunger of white-collar survival. "Why should I take a letter from someone you've been reading to instead of going through formal channels? Why does this envelope carry the weight you think it does?" "Because Thomas Edwards invests in this company," I said. I let each word sit like a coin on the table. She laughed, a high dissonant sound. "Invests? He is one investor among many. He does not direct operations. He is not on the board." "He is a major investor," I corrected, "and he has made the decision to attach conditions." Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time that day I saw a flicker of genuine panic. It was not theatrical. It was an animal alarm. "Conditions?" she echoed. "What conditions?" "Read it," I said. "Open it." She hesitated like someone peeling a bandage, aware of pain but unwilling to risk the clean end of it. The office leaned in the improbable hush of people watching the future unfold. Her fingers broke the wax seal and slid the letter out, the paper unfolding with a fragile dignity. She read for a long time. I watched her eyes work the paragraphs, the movement of comprehension. Her face was a map of computations, legal, financial, moral. She stopped on a line and then reread it. The room smelled of the coffee she'd abandoned at her desk that morning. It smelled of new facts. When she finally looked up, the woman who demanded reliability looked like somebody who might be bargaining for it. "This is," she began, and then the sentence dissolved into a different grammar. She cleared her throat. "If Thomas is withdrawing his funding, that could imperil our expansion, our flagship account. We could lose clients. We would have to choose between policies and people," I said. Her jaw closed. For a moment she said nothing, and the click of the city outside filled the silence like a new soundtrack. The game had shifted. The letter had recalibrated the room in a way that no one debate could have. She had all the choices she had always had, and now she had the knowledge that some of them were contingent. "You're not wrong," she said, the line thin as a wire. "This changes things." She looked at me then in a way that softened not into kindness, but into negotiation. "You delivered the letter. Now, what do you want? Are you asking for reinstatement? For a public apology?" I felt the room tilt again. Negotiation had started before I had spoken. "I want what Thomas asked for," I said. "Whatever it is, I want those terms to be considered." She watched me like someone appraising a new product's user manual. "And if I refuse?" she asked. "Then he will withdraw his investment," I said. I said it because I had been given to say it, because the envelope had a purpose, and the purpose was leverage. Victoria's face drained of color. For the first time she looked exactly like the kind of executive 100 wall photos had warned about. the kind who had built an image on certainty and now found that certainty a little less certain. Her hands began to move, a subtle choreography of someone calculating impact. "Give me the letter," she said finally, not as a command, but as the opening of a treaty. I handed it over. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she sat down at her desk and closed her eyes for a moment, as if to collect herself, the way I sometimes did before a big presentation. When she opened her eyes again, there was a change. Some old armor had been removed. "This won't be simple," she said. "Marshall and Associates has protocols. We have outside counsel. We have stakeholders. I am not someone who can sign a blank check." "Neither am I," said. Her laugh now was unsteady. "Then let's begin a conversation." We had reached the moment of the decision, not yet made, but clearly in sight. The envelope had been a key. Now every lock was visible. Her assistant and her right hand started to dial numbers and send emails, the professional reflexes of a company that knew how to mobilize when its lifeline trembled. I stood by the window, watching the skyline as if seeing it for the first time through a different set of expectations. "Why are you doing this?" Victoria asked suddenly, softer than before. The question was not rhetorical. It was honest in a way that made me think I might be given the chance to speak plainly. "Because he asked me to," I said, "and because some things are worth more than my job title." She looked like she wanted to say something sharp, something dismissive. Instead, she inhaled and then directed it toward procedure. "All right," she said. "We will convene. But understand that this is not a public theater. If you wish to influence the firm, you must be prepared to engage with its machinery." I understood. I also understood that the machinery was not neutral. It bent in certain directions depending on who was pulling the levers. Now something heavier than policy had been introduced into the office. It was the moral weight of a man who had invested not just his money, but his attention in the company. It was the presence of an envelope that could not be ignored. As I left the office, the city felt both smaller and infinitely vast, like the difference between a photograph and a life. The envelope was no longer in my hands. It had done its first work. I walked out of the building with the strange sensation that losing my job had been an opening rather than a closing. I had always believed that large changes began with a single uneven step. I had not anticipated that the step might be the tearing of a page or the folding of a letter. I went back to the hospital afterward because that was where the axis of my life now turned. Thomas was awake and smiling when I came in, his eyes lighting at the sight of the briefcase image in my hands. "How'd it go?" he asked. I told him in fragments, letting the facts land like small stones. He took them all in as if making a small wall. When I finished, he inhaled and let out a breath that shook like a small bell. "Good," he said. "Good. See? Letters still have teeth." "I hope her change is real," I admitted. "I hope she signs what he asks." "Hope is an interesting thing," he said, wry as ever. "You can't base an operation on it, but you can base an action on it." I sat with that idea in the quiet. Outside, the city spun on, the glass towers and the commuter trains, the news cycles and the movable charts of markets. Inside the hospital room, the world had shrunk to a bedside lamp and two people, a stack of books, and one envelope that had altered a course of months. It felt both fragile and formidable. When I stepped out into the corridor again, the city air felt like an audience waiting for an act to begin. The next move would be hers. The next move would determine whether the life I'd been drawn into, of bedside reading and small patient rituals, would be recognized as important in a boardroom that mostly valued currency over care. There was more to come. The envelopes would be opened further, the council would be consulted, the company's mechanisms would rattle. But for now, the crucial hinge had been struck. My firing had become the agent of leverage the moment the investor named my patient, and not even Victoria had seen it coming. I went home that night with the echo of Victoria's measured breath at the desk, and the memory of Thomas's hand holding mine. The torn leave request still lived in my tote. a small, jagged monument to an instant of clarity. I placed it on my kitchen counter and looked at it until the city faded out of focus, and the thought that had been forming in me the whole day about how one small act can reroute systems settled like a tide. I did not know, in that quiet hour, whether the change to come would be lasting. I knew only that I had been present for something that would force people to choose, and that choice was not always simple or pretty. It involved lawyers, spreadsheets, reputations, the fragile private thing of a dying man's last wishes. It involved Victoria's capacity to face a moral mirror. It involved me, an account executive without a job, and yet with a letter in my hand that had already rearranged the furniture of power. Outside my window, the city lights blinked in their indifferent pattern. Inside, on my table, a paperback lay open where I'd fallen asleep reading last week. The torn form rested like a relic. The next morning would require new conversations and new courage. I slept as best I could, the image of the wax seal pressed not on paper, but on the inside of my mind. When dawn came, I went back to the hospital. Thomas was waiting, as he always was, by the window, the stack of books like sentinels on the bedside table. He smiled at me as if the letter had already succeeded. "They will find a way to be themselves until they don't," he said. "That's a terrifying sentence," I replied. "It's honest," he said. "And what's the use of anything else? You did the right thing, Sarah. Even if nothing changes, you did the right thing." There was a firmness in that did not need salvation. It was not absolution. It was a recognition of a moral axis. The act itself could be the thing that mattered. A week passed with a slow building hum at the office. Calls were made, documents exchanged. I received one request to speak with outside counsel, not as an accused, but as a witness to the timeline. Victoria sent an email asking if I'd be willing to meet, just to clarify details. It was the first careful olive branch I'd received since she had ripped my request. I accepted, because if leverage demands conversation, then conversation is the next field of battle. But before the meeting could be scheduled, the hospital became a place where days counted differently. Thomas had good hours and bad hours, and the counts were never neutral. There were mornings when he was sharp and afternoons when the morphine made him a philosopher who spoke in pieces. He loved to correct me on small facts about literature. He hated the way people mistook sentiment for weakness. On one of the nights when he slept after hours of coughing, I sat by the window and opened one of the newer books he'd been gifted, a slim memoir about choices and second acts. I read aloud, voice low, not because the words were miraculous, but because repetition gives life to small things. For hours I read and reread, my voice the metronome in the room. At some point, late in the night, he reached for my hand and didn't let go. "Promise me," he said. "Promise you what?" I asked, because against the long night it felt right to answer with concrete words. "Promise me you'll keep at it," he said, "whatever it means. Promise me you'll keep making noise when silence is the safer option." I turned my palm to his and saw the paper-thin skin of a man who had lived in suits and boardrooms and country clubs, and now measured his remaining hours by the softness of a hand held. I promised him. The promise felt like a life buoy tossed and then taken up. The next morning, a legal assistant from Marshall & Associates called to ask if I'd be willing to give a full account of the timeline of events, and whether I had documentation of my leave request. I told her I would provide what I had. She sounded neutral, professional, the kind of voice trained to set a neutral tone. Underneath it, I could hear the machinery of a company in slow mobilization. When I walked into Victoria's building again, this time for a meeting, the lobby hummed with more purpose. People glanced up in their cubicles when Marshall & Associates' name arrived in an email. Gossip is the substitute language of offices bereft of the facts. It supplied its own pictures, the envelope as cudgel, the investor as a villain, the fired employee as a martyr or a fool, depending on the teller's taste. I took the stairs again. wanting the motion to be deliberate, because escalators make people feel powerless, and steps beckon small agency. On the third floor, Mark from Creative caught me. On the third floor, Mark from Creative caught me by the stairwell, paint smudge on his sleeve like a badge. He grinned with the sort of sympathy that has fewer words and more eyebrows. "You look like you swallowed a board meeting," he said. "I feel like I swallowed a board meeting," I admitted. He walked with me the last few steps, like someone escorting a friend into a ring. "Be careful," he added, and meant something broader than the warning. Office pleasantries have a bottom. People care, but they also want to know where the story will settle. The meeting room smelled of old coffee and new tension. Outside counsel had a folder for each attendee, corporate templates that would be used to translate one man's bedside conviction into legalese. Victoria arrived a few minutes late, hair pulled into the precise knot that made the back of her neck look like an argument settled. She glanced at me with a calculation I recognized, assessing currency. She sat at the head of the table and folded her hands, as if containment were a posture. The counsel asked me for a plain recitation of dates. I told them when I had turned my note in, when Victoria had ripped it, and the timeline of visits. I handed over a copy of the torn request, more ritual than exhibit, and the sealed envelope's ledger of custody. They asked gentle procedural questions. I answered plainly. I did not dramatize. Plainness has its own authority. After that, the room stalled on the content of Thomas's conditions. Victoria's legal team and her board liaison argued about precedent and fiduciary duty, as if they were debating a narrower taxonomy of risk. I listened to phrases like material adverse change and contingent capital, and tried to remember Thomas's voice telling me letters live in drawers. I realized how much of corporate life runs on definitions, and how quickly a definition can bend a person's future. The conditions themselves were not theatrical. They read like the product of someone who had built and then stripped down complexity. A formal leave policy guaranteeing employees a statutorily permitted period of paid medical leave for caregiving situations. An independent ombudsperson to review disputed dismissals. A company-wide employee satisfaction survey administered by an external auditor, with public reporting to investors, and the creation of a director-level role to oversee implementation and ensure compliance. There were other items: funds for caregiver support programs, formal training for managers, but those four were the spine. Victoria bristled at the language that implied structural change. "We can pilot programs," she said at one point. "We can adopt guidelines. But you're proposing to hand over operational decisions to someone who isn't in our management track." Her voice sharpened like someone protecting scaffolding they'd built. "It isn't about handing over control," Thomas's letter read in the council's summary. "It's about aligning incentives with the dignity of the people who make this firm work." The words were faintly formal and startlingly direct, as if the man who had written them had found a way to put bedside clarity into legal grammar. The leverage was clear. The letter's conditions were framed as a covenant tied to continued capital commitment. If the firm accepted, the funding would remain. If it refused, Thomas's investment vehicle reserved the right to withdraw over a phased period, enough to unsettle cash flows and imperil a growth plan the firm had already sold to clients. It was the kind of power an investor has when they decide their capital will carry not only returns, but moral testaments. The bargaining moved like a tide. Victoria countered with phased commitments and audited progress reports rather than fixed governance changes. I pushed back, quietly but persistently. I had no innate authority in that room beyond the witness of what had happened, the moral clarity of seeing someone dismissed for doing something that few would call brave and many would call necessary. But the envelope had given me a platform. Thomas's insistence had lent it weight. "These items are not symbolic," I said when it was my turn to speak without counsel. "They're safeguards. They make it harder for someone to say a person who needs to be with a dying relative is insubordinate. They create process, So the next time a human thing collides with a business thing, there's a mechanism that values the human. Victoria's eyes flickered. Annoyance, calculation, a fraction of understanding. And you would have me cede operational autonomy. No, I replied. You would have Maria, the ombudsperson, and an external auditor report to the board and to investors. You would agree to a schedule for training and a measurable baseline for employee satisfaction. It is governance, not charity. She closed her eyes for a moment and let out a breath. If I sign this, I am accepting oversight that could complicate decisions, she said. I risk being second-guessed by people who don't sit in these rooms. And you risk being second-guessed by people who only see the headlines, I answered. Which is worse. The room held its breath. Negotiation is a kind of arithmetic that yields different sums depending on which variables you permit. In the end, what moved Victoria was not rhetoric, but consequence. The council, after running scenarios, showed her a plausible exit of accounts and a client who would balk at instability. That possibility, together with the moral weight of Thomas's name in the investor circles that mattered to her, made the calculus lean the other way. We will draft an agreement, she said at last, a binding covenant with milestones. We will hire an external auditor. We will create the role described in the letter, and we will commit to the first employee satisfaction survey within 6 months. But we will draft the language to protect the firm's need to operate. It wasn't capitulation so much as a contractual middle. I accepted the compromise because it would lock the basics into paper, and paper, for all its slippery repute, can be a stubborn thing. I left the room with a copy of the draft agreement under my arm and the gnawing knowledge that paperwork does not equal lived reality. Change lives in implementation. It is built in the slow labor of forms and follow-ups, training and meetings, and the relentless work of habit. Over the next weeks, I walked both worlds. Mornings were for Thomas and the small rites that made his hours softer, reading until his voice thinned, arguing about whether Gatsby's green light was more hope than delusion, laughing when he misattributed a line to a different author. Afternoons and evenings were occupied with meetings, drafting charters, speaking to counsel, meeting with HR consultants. I found myself translating bedside metaphors into policy language, and policy language back into bedside sensibility. It felt like walking a bridge built of different materials on either side. Thomas's favorite moment during that period was to prod me when I wore a suit to a meeting. "You look like you might be testifying in a play," he'd say. "You'll need to ad-lib sincerity." "Better than ad-libbing courage," I'd reply. He delighted in small absurdities. He wanted to know whether the ombudsperson would have an office plant, whether the external auditor would accept tea, whether the director would get a parking space that did not require an exhibit. He joked because jokes rearranged the room for him, made it less clinical, less finite. Slowly, the company began to produce the artifacts of change. A